God. And this is one of the saddest stories in the Scriptures. The book of Lamentations can be compared to the account of in Revelation 18 outlined. In Lamentations, the prophet of God weeps over the destruction of Jerusalem, the messianic city. In Revelation 18, the merchants of greed weep over the destruction of Babylon, the materialistic city. In the midst of sorrow, however, Jeremiah has reason for hope, but the merchants possess no such hope. Lamentations is the only biblical book which, for the most part, is arranged in acrostic fashion. So the first word in each of the 22 verses of chapters 1, 2, and 4 begins with the 22 successive letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And the Jews have for centuries publicly read Lamentations each year on the 9th of the month of Av, that's AB, to commemorate both the destruction of the temple in 586 BC and also that of the Second Temple in AD 70. One of the great passages on God's faithfulness is found in Lamentations chapter 3, verse 21 through 33. And this compares with 2 Timothy 2:13. This book marks the second horrible occasion on which women ate their children in times of starvation. Compare Lamentations 2:20 with 2 Kings 6:28 and 29. And these are fulfillments of the prophecy in Leviticus 26:29. Tradition says Jeremiah sat weeping outside Jerusalem's north wall under the knoll called Golgotha, where Christ would later die. This book is in essence the Wailing Wall of the Bible. It is quoted from or alluded to 7 times by 6 New Testament books. Okay, so around 1000 BC, David had established his capital in Jerusalem in 2 Samuel 6. Thus, God had blessed this beloved city for nearly 400 years. He had allowed the northern kingdom to be carried away by the Assyrians in 721 BC. But Jerusalem had been spared for another 115 years. All this mercy and long-suffering, however, had been in vain, for Judah continued provoking the Holy One of Israel through constant sinning. The end had now come. Judah is gone into captivity because of affliction and because of great servitude. She dwelleth among the heathen. She findeth no rest. All of her persecutors overtook her between the straits. Jerusalem hath grievously sinned. Therefore she is removed. All that honor her despise her, because they have seen her nakedness. Yea, she sigheth and turneth backward. Zion spreadeth forth her hands, and there is none to comfort her. The Lord hath commanded concerning Jacob, and that his adversaries should be round about him. Jerusalem is as a menstruous woman among them. Chapter 1, verse 3, verse 8, and verse 17. So the punishment comes from God. Chapter 2, it had destroyed every home in Judah. Verse 2, every fortress and wall broken. Verse 2, he bent his bow of judgment across the land. Verse 4, he allowed his own temple to fall as though it were a booth of leaves and branches in a garden. Verse 6. So you know the same thing was being said then as when Jesus said the temple in AD 70 would be destroyed. God's not going to let this happen. This is his temple. God's not going to let his temple be destroyed. That was the fall of man. So in other words, we can do whatever we want to do, and that's not going to happen. In other instances, they would say things like, we're Abraham's children. So what does that mean? Well, God's not going to let nothing happen to us. We're Abraham's children. So some people you will hear that, hey, we live in, and you put whatever nation. God's not going to let nothing. Well, God's intolerant of sin, no matter what that sin is. Okay, and He'll judge sin in His own people. Okay, we need to know the depths of our sin. All right. He did allow His own temple to fall. Judah's enemies were given full freedom to ridicule and destroy her citizens. Chapter 2, verse 15 and 16. Her people, old and young alike, choked the streets of Jerusalem with their lifeless bodies. Chapter 2, verse 21. Sad story and testimony. But sin is destructive. Sin earns death. Okay? That's the earnings of our sin. And that's what happened. So that element of God's protection is taken away, basically. Okay? God protects His grace through His grace and mercy. It's not that we deserve anything, but through His grace and mercy, He gives us and He protects us. But when He pulls that back, that hedge of protection, see, it's not us. When things are going good, a lot of people will start thinking, man, it's because I'm so spiritual, man. I mean, boy, God's just lucky to have, God's blessing me because, I've got it all together. No.
A lot of people believe that.
A lot of people believe.
Yeah, they do.
Big time.
God's, my heart, where's my heart? I know when we're at our closest of God, we're like Paul, I'm the chief of sinners. See, we're going to be more humble, not more cocky, prideful, things like that. Oh God, how could you save a wretch like me? Say, God, what a wretched man I am. He wasn't getting away from God. He was getting close to God. See, when he says things like that. He was never more closer to God. We looked at last week, Isaiah. He looked at other people and he thought, wow, man. He came in the presence of God, got close to God, and he said, man, I'm a man of unclean lips. Oh, my goodness. He looked at it, and all of a sudden he saw, I'm filthy compared to the righteousness of Christ and God. So this was the punishment. And of course God allowed it, and God brought it. And God will discipline us, even as His people today. So the afflictions, the prophet of God, you see in chapter 3. And then chapter 4, the people of God. Chapter 3, the afflictions of the prophet. We've talked about that, but he suffered from a twofold affliction here. He was afflicted by his people, pain, persecution. He endured at the hands of his own countrymen, even before the Babylonian invasion. And then he was afflicted with his people. Jeremiah, even though a faithful prophet, also felt that frightful divine judgment poured out upon sinful Judah. That's the sad part of it, isn't it? That we're going to suffer too when, things start turning, as we see our own nation digressing and things. We're suffering with it. We're suffering for it. Our heart, it hurts us deeply, but we're suffering with them as well. Okay?
Just like right now.
Yeah. And just know any true pastor of God or any true person in ministry, as they minister to God people, and that person, say, backslides or rebels or just quits on God or something, that person, that minister, the servant of God's heart's breaking first for them, but it also affects their whole ministry. It affects, so see, they're not only hurting and suffering for them, but they're hurting and suffering with them. because that person brings them into, their hurt. So you say you have a local congregation, somebody just walks away. Okay? So you're hurting for them because you know what's out there. You know God doesn't, in that sense. Now they're not doing right. Now, there's good reasons and bad reasons, okay? So say it's not good reasons, okay, in that sense. But then your heart, okay, hurts. I don't know. I mean, I know, I guess certain preachers probably rejoice when certain people leave. But for me, it's always hurt. It's always hurt. And anything. And here, so he was afflicted with his people as well. He's given an assurance in chapter 3, verse 21 through 27, 30, verse 31 through 33. In the midst of that terrible storm, there's shown a ray of reassurance there. This I recall to mind, therefore have I hope, he says. It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning, great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, saith my soul, therefore will I hope in him. The Lord is good unto them that wait for him, to the soul that seeketh him. It is good that a man should both hope and quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth. For the Lord will not cast off forever, but though he cause grief, yet will he have compassion according to the multitude of his mercies. For he doth not afflict willingly, nor grieve the children of men. He does not desire to do that. Okay. But sometimes, in the reality of life and the reality of things the way they are, that's where we're at. Okay. So, have you ever known godly parents raise a child, and then that child rebel? You think of the grief that causes those parents, and how they hurt. And no parent is perfect, right? No parent is perfect in their parenting. So they might look back and they say, man, we maybe should have done this and all. But in it, they were sincere and they tried and they loved God. Think of the grief, say, that it causes, and this is what God's saying. And they got to think, man, we just tried to do what was right. And now they're suffering for it. Okay? Well, that's going to happen. It's the reality that other people's choices and decisions still affect us, okay, in our life. The reality of life. He gave some advice. Let us search. This is found in chapter 3, verse 40, 41. Let us search and try our ways and turn again to the Lord. Let us lift up our heart with our hands unto God in the heavens. So we've got to look into our own hearts. Anything we go through, we have to look into our own hearts. Okay? All right, Lord. Because God's always teaching us and always growing us. What are you teaching me now? Okay? What are you teaching me now? Chapter 4, the people of God, the children's tongue stuck to the roof of their mouths for thirst. 4, the cream of Judah's youth were treated as earthenware pots. 4:2, also 5:13. The rich and pampered were in the streets begging for bread. 4:5. Could you imagine this if it happened to our land, the rich and pampered, being in the street begging for bread? Begging for bread. Some of that did happen back in time of the Great Depression and stuff, didn't it? Some people committed suicide because they lost it all. Some wasn't living as well and had people they demeaned or looked down upon, they had to be right there with them. And all of a sudden. Their mighty princes, once lean and tan, were now but skin and bones, and their faces black as soot. Tender-hearted women had cooked and eaten their own children. So think of the starvation I had. It's tough right there. Breaks your heart, don't it? False prophets and priests were blindly staggering through the streets covered with blood. 4:14. The king himself, Zedekiah, had been captured, blinded, and carried off into captivity. Chapter 40, verse 20. And then chapter 5 is the prayer. That prayer of remembrance. Remember, verse 1, O Lord, what is come upon us, consider and behold our reproach. Prayer of repentance in verse 16, the crown has fallen from our head, woe unto us that we have sinned. They finally understand, okay? No more excuses. We've sinned. We're guilty. And then that of recognition. Verse 19 of chapter 5, Thou, O Lord, remainest forever, thy throne from generation to generation. Okay, so just remember, as they're going through these things, they still knew the time frame of it. Okay, so you could get your heart set right, but there's still consequences. Somebody drinks or something for several years, say they get saved, they're born again as anybody's born again, and accepted in the beloved, but in the physical sense, there still could be consequences of that, okay, of that sin. Say somebody lives and he been committing adultery on his wife, okay, and somehow or another he's at a service or something, but he gets saved. I mean, God begins to deal with his heart, and he gets saved. Well, now what's he going to do? So he's got a new heart, and he said, man, I got to make things right. I got to go tell my wife. See, all of a sudden, something he never cared about confessing or telling, or he was just keeping a secret. Now all of a sudden he's got to go confess his sin to his wife. What's that going to do to her? I'm glad you're saved, but I can't believe you did this to me. So he's shocked. Okay, so there's some consequences. What are we going to do about it? You know, sure, God's forgiven you, He saved you, but man, I got, you know, how's she going to respond? So it's got to be a healing process through all that, don't they? They have to do different things. There's still consequences. They have children. Okay, let's say they have children. Children, they've always looked up to dad. All of a sudden, dad's hurt their mom more than anybody's ever could hurt her before. Okay? So they're standoffish. You see? They got saved, born again, but there were still consequences to his life actions. And the same here. Okay? So they're told to buckle up. There's still consequences. Okay? All right, that brings us to Ezekiel. All right, so we'll look at, give a little outline, at least to get us started here in Ezekiel. So while Jeremiah was ministering to the people in Judah, Ezekiel was ministering to the exiles in Babylon. He was taken to Babylon in 597 BC with the second deportation, and 5 years later he received his call to ministry. Around 592 BC, so you're working backwards in years down to 0, remember. Like Jeremiah, he was a priest who was called to be a prophet, and also like Jeremiah, he preached action sermons that caught the attention of the people. There are 4 sections in the book. God's call of Ezekiel, chapters 1 through 3. God's judgment on Jerusalem, chapters 4 through 24. God's judgment on the nations, chapters 25 through 32. And God's restoration of his people, chapter 33 through 48. Ezekiel's prophecy emphasizes the glory of God and the honor of God's name. 67 times the statement, I am the Lord, is found in this book. And several times God is said to act for his name's sake, so that his holy name would not be profaned. Had the people of Judah been concerned for the honor of the Lord, he would not have dishonored them before their enemies. Okay? Ezekiel was the final one of 4 Old Testament author prophets who also had this priestly background: Moses, Ezra, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. The distinct phrases leading to the eventual destruction of the city of Jerusalem. Phases. Again, you have the 605 BC, the 597, and the 586. Okay. Now, no other biblical preacher before or since was so dramatic and illustrative in his preaching as was Ezekiel. So he dramatized his sermons. Okay. That was his calling. That's why he got it. So, included among his visual aid attention grabbers were maps, drawings, ground reclining, head shaving, foot stomping, hand clapping, wall digging, sword slashing, and pot boiling activities. But the sudden death of his beloved wife, upon the sudden death of his beloved wife, he remained tearless at God's command to illustrate a spiritual truth. So he was illustrative, okay, communicator. He preached illustrative, okay, drama, illustrated his sermons. This is another way that God was going to illustrate. Could you imagine? So here was a man who lost his... maybe you could identify with Ezekiel and see what he'd gone through. But yet he was still to preach the word. And then as illustrative of God's point, to remain, to not cry. Ezekiel gives us the most extended and detailed description of the cherubims in the Bible, chapter 1 and chapter 10. Ezekiel denounces a materialistic city of Tyre, chapter 26, and describes the millennial city of God, chapter 40. His prophecy concerning Tyre's destruction is possibly the greatest non-messianic prediction in the Old Testament, chapter 26. His is the final of 2 Old Testament books depicting the activity of Satan before his fall. We saw in Isaiah 14, verse 12 through 17, but in Ezekiel 28, verse 11 through 19, I was sharing before the king of Tyre, but he's really talking there about Satan himself, which was behind the whole thing. He records the removal of God's glory cloud. That's a big event in the nation. Chapter 10, verse 18, and predicts the return of this glory cloud in chapter 43, verse 20. The book contains the most lengthy description of judgment upon Egypt in the entire Bible. Chapters 29 through 32 is the only biblical book which speaks of the future Russian invasion into Israel, chapters 38 through and chapters 39. The most vivid Old Testament vision, the valley with dry bones, is found in Ezekiel 37. An comparison can be seen between Ezekiel 34 and John chapter 10. So in Ezekiel 34, you might want to jot down beside John 10. And then both speak of the characteristics of true and false shepherds. Ezekiel 16 and the book of Hosea, they can be contrasted. And Ezekiel 16 depicts God's chosen nation as an ungrateful and the immoral adopted orphan daughter. The book of Hosea describes that nation as an untrue and adulterous wife. This book describes the last of 7 biblical temples. So you have the tabernacle of Moses, the temple of Solomon, the temple of Zerubbabel and Herod, the temple of Christ's body, the spiritual temple, the church. Church is called the temple of God as well. The tribulational temple, and then the millennial temple. Is quoted from or alluded to 151 times by 17 New Testament writers. The book of Ezekiel lends itself to the following 7-fold outline. This is another outline of it. Okay.